Good evening, sir.
Jennifer,
I had
Paul changed it, but he doesn't know how.
I had a long conversation with Andrea from the Business Journal.
I called her back. She left me a message Friday night.
Yeah,
She says, I'm on a deadline for Monday. Can you call me? I got it this morning. I called her back and never heard anything from
I
her.
called her Sunday and texted her Sunday also. She called me back. Probably the biggest thing that I had to say was, I don't know how people got it in their head that we're in competition with CRDC. That absolutely is not true. And went around that a little bit and then said, for example, Camas did not decrease their contribution to CRDC. The port did not decrease theirs. And in fact, Washougal joined CRDC for the first time in anyone's memory. Not only that, but we chose to fund our economic development agency exclusively with public funds so that we would not be competing for private funds with either CRDC or And the only other thing I said was that in addition to this, we're still looking for retail, that if you look at both Camas and Washougal, at their general fund revenues, compared to regional cities in general, we are relatively poor in retail sales tax. So that's
I figured she was past her deadline. So. Jennifer, we ready? Good evening. I'd like to welcome you to the October 24th Washougal City Council Workshop Meeting. Jennifer, could you call the roll, please?
Mayor, I'm going to call the roll. She's just doing a last-minute shuffle with the presentation. So, Councilmember Costin, Councilmember Shoemaker,
Here.
Councilmember McDaniel,
Here.
Councilmember Delavar,
Present.
Councilmember Greenlee,
Here.
Councilmember Morris, and Councilmember Russell.
We received a message from Councilman Russell that he will be out this evening, and I also received a call from Councilwoman Costin that she had an urgent matter that came up at the last minute this evening and will not be here. Do we have any members of the public who would like to address council before we start this evening? Okay. Agenda bills. Public Works. Rob, you've got one.
Yes, thank you, Mayor, Council. The item before you is a resolution for the Coordinated Water System Plan for Clark County. Washougal is a part of Clark County, obviously, and what the Coordinated Water System Plan does is essentially break up the entire county into service areas so that we know as cities moving forward and Clark Public Utilities that we have areas that we will plan to serve in the future. And that's essentially what this resolution does.
And this just backs up the interlocal agreement that we approved last meeting with the resolution itself.
Correct, that had a fire hydrant attachment as well.
Questions of council? Okay. Moving along to the fun part of this evening. Finance. She's almost ready.
Getting there. Thank you for your patience. Line those out. What we can just do. Take that one off the top. Good enough. All right.
This is the presentation.
I guess you've got one in your notepad there.
Okay.
Have you got one more? Have you got one more?
Yeah. If they want them, or they have them in there.
Yeah. Perfect, thanks.
Okay, we've got a third quarter update.
So our agenda for the evening, thank you for your patience in getting a few things together. I apologize for the shuffling. The flu has hit my household last week, so I apologize. It took a little longer to get this together today, as I wasn't here Friday. Third quarter update will be first, and then we'll jump right into the 2012 preliminary mayor's budget. And then we'll discuss the next steps involved in the budget process. And we actually have notebooks for each of you to go through to show you the setup of all the fund by fund, department by department information. So in the third quarter, the revenues are about 71.6% of the budget, and that's normal because the third quarter, the property taxes haven't hit. Those come in October, the second half. So we don't expect that to be the full 75% yet. Property taxes are at 62% currently, or as of the end of third quarter. The utility taxes and sales tax are on target. The community development revenues are doing extremely well. We're at 150% of the budget, and we're already 8.6% ahead of where we ended 2011 at. So that's very positive for the strength of the community with building and planning.
I'm sorry, do you mean 2010? Or you said you're 8.6% ahead of
Yes, I-
2010?
That's a
Right.
typo. Thank you. The general charges are at the 50% of the budget, and the interest earnings are higher because of the long-term investing that we've been doing with bonds versus just the LGIP. So here's the spreadsheet. Okay, thank you. Sorry, I have a paper cut. Just to show you the numbers as they stand out. Again, the percentages we just discussed are there, and the total revenues for the third quarter. Then we compare it to the 2010 third quarter actual versus so you can see we're right on target. We're a little higher than 2010. So we're tracking right along. On the expense side, we're at about 65.9% of the budget. The street fund's at 75%, police 71, fire 69. Personnel costs are coming in pretty much right at target. So it's, again, pretty boring for the third quarter, again, because the revenues for the property taxes haven't caught up yet, and expenses are tracking well. The departments are continuing to have restraint with the expenses and toe the line to make sure that we're doing what's best for the city. So here's the actual breakouts with the numbers to show by department where we're tracking for the year.
There are 1,400 calls and 1,401 now.
Such service here. This is awesome. Questions, comments? All right, for the utility funds,
Well,
they.
I was just going to say one thing, is
Oh.
boring is good.
Thank you, sir. For the utility departments, they as well are tracking right along where we expect them to. They're at about 75% of both the stormwater revenues and stormwater expense budget. Same for water sewer expenditures and stormwater. They're 80 and 65 respectively. So they're right on track. And another visual for you with the actual numbers. And then here's the spreadsheet everybody loves with all of the funds listed that you can't really see, but hopefully in your handout you can see it a little bit better, and if you have any questions. This is the operational revenues and expenditures, so for the general and street fund, we're currently at a minor deficit, and again, that's due to the property tax timing. We get those in, we're currently getting them in this month, so we'll have better projections for that at the end of the month, beginning of next month. And we're moving right along. For an investment update, I just wanted to give you the third quarter LGIP, how wonderfully it's doing. Wonderfully is a word. It is declining, as you would probably expect. And then here's how much we've earned year-to-date for LGIP citywide. We've earned $11,000. with the bond investments that we've been doing with the reserve funds and the bond funds that aren't currently being used and are slated for the 2012, 2013 projects, we invested that money to provide income to the water sewer funds for the capital projects. We've currently made $55,000 to date in interest on those funds. And we're carrying a portfolio of $12.2 million maturity value. That's all I have for the third quarter update. Do you have any questions, comments?
I was going to ask somebody, there's no one from community development, so never mind.
Mitch is
Mitch
Oh,
is
I'm
here.
sorry, Mitch. Do you have any sense, I mean, we're running well ahead of our projections on residential construction. I hear anecdotally that Camas is also. Do you hear anything about the rest of the county? Are we the bright spot, or is the rest of the county coming in a little better than expected?
I haven't heard anything specific, but I haven't heard anybody bemoaning it either. Not like they're saying they're so far behind or anything like that. I can find out specifically where we kind of stand, let you know that.
Just kind of,
Sure.
I'm curious.
Does Paul,
Sure.
would Paul have a feel for that?
Do you have it?
I don't have any specific data on that. I haven't looked at the permit data. Anecdotally, I've heard that things have picked up, but I'm not sure what that was relative to in terms of expectations or last year, so.
And then I guess along with that for finance, of course, anytime there's real estate, there's REITs.
Mhm.
So it'd be kind of interesting to get some kind of anecdotal evidence on real estate excise taxes, how we're doing and how the rest of the county is doing.
I don't have that comparatively tonight, but I can
Oh, I'm
definitely get that.
sure. Yeah,
Definitely.
it just occurred to me within the past 2 minutes, so.
Any other questions from council as far as the third quarter updates? Okay. Now we're going to start diving into a 2012 preliminary budget. Members of the City Council and residents of Washougal, I'm pleased to present my proposed City of Washougal 2012 budget. This budget reflects input that we've received from the community as part of our ongoing strategic planning process. It is the product of solid efforts of our city leadership team. It is conservative, and I'm pleased to announce that it is balanced. I'm happy to report that the downward trend in our assessed valuation has begun to stabilize, according to preliminary information from the County Assessor's Office. While down slightly from 2011, our projected 2012 assessed valuation is significantly improved from earlier projections. As you may recall, in 2011, our assessed valuation fell 13%. In 2012, our total assessed valuation, including a 1.1% increase in new construction, will be down only 0.86%. While this is positive news, we have remained cautious in budgeting. We continue to constrain our expenses while our revenues are projected to slightly increase. We are also ensuring that we maintain a healthy and adequate reserve. In short, Washougal is in a stable financial position relative to the current state of the economy. As a key investment in our community, I am asking the council in the 2012 budget to approve restoring a police officer position. I am also proposing, even before 2012, that you fund 2 accounts that will allow us to continue to adequately maintain our infrastructure and prepare for future needs. In 2009, we had 20 sworn police officer positions in the Washougal Police Department. Over the last 2 years, 2 positions were vacated through a resignation and a retirement, and those 2 positions are no longer part of the budget. The result is that we now have 18 sworn officers, including the chief of police. During the same period, our call volume has more than doubled from 8,245 calls in 2009 to an estimated 16,545 calls for service in 2011. This dramatic rise in calls at the same time that our staffing has gone down is a cause for concern for the safety of the community and for our officers. Accordingly, I'm asking the council to restore one patrol position starting January 1, 2012. After implementing the 2011 budget, Washougal holds reserves totaling 41% of our proposed 2012 general and street fund operating budgets. As you know, reserves of 16% of the operating budget are required and are restricted for internal cash flow purposes per council policy. The additional 25% that we hold in reserves are unrestricted savings of more than $2.6 million and currently there are no specified plans for those funds. Before the end of 2011, I'm requesting that the council move $1.25 million of these unrestricted reserves to reestablish funds to the Facilities Capital Fund and to create a Transportation Capital Fund. The Facilities Capital Fund is intended to be used for ongoing capital maintenance items for our facilities and to save for future facilities needs. The Transportation Capital Fund is intended to be used to provide matching funds for transportation grants as we continue to pursue our transportation facilities plans. Heading into 2012, we'll continue to use restraint in spending in all the departments and accounts. In 2010 and 2011, we focused on stabilizing our general fund and streamlining our efficiencies. Starting in 2012, we'll expand our focus to other funds in an effort to find further efficiencies. Overall, this budget continues to move our community forward while maintaining fiscal prudence. I look forward to answering any questions you may have and working with the council as we continue to make our operations more effective and efficient while enhancing services for our citizens. David, would you like to take the first part of the presentation?
Thank you, Mayor. We're going to delve into the budget at a progressively more detailed level as we move forward. And so first we'll provide some context for how the mayor's budget was developed. And one of those contexts, as you know, is we're in the midst of a strategic planning process, and we reached a key milestone here over the last month, and that was that our public outreach process is completed. And although we have quite a ways to go still in terms of fully developing our strategic plan, we thought it was important to check in with the results of that outreach so that we had a feel for it and that it could inform our budgeting process and the priorities and decision-making in the mayor's budget. The preliminary results that we have indicate that 5 areas of importance have risen to the surface, if you would, as part of that feedback process. They aren't necessarily in priority order here, although preliminary results indicate this may end up being the priority order, but we haven't fully vetted all of the data yet and worked it through. And as you can see, one of the reasons why this is a great community are our parks and trails and open spaces and the natural beauty. Continued emphasis in that area has risen to the top from our community. As you might imagine, economic development, given the state of the economy, job creation, et cetera, is very important to the community. Our emergency services and public safety are very important. Folks are proud of our downtown, and continued revitalization there has been mentioned. And then, of course, our transportation infrastructure, our ability to move ourselves around, and goods and services are really important to the community. So with that as some context, that filtered into our budget process. But again, that's preliminary, and we have a long way to go on the strategic plan. And on November 14th, you can expect an update from Trevor and Joanne on the status of that project. So the key assumptions that the mayor mentioned in brief, but more specifically on the revenue side in the general and street funds, there are no new taxes proposed in this budget, status quo across the board on all of those types of revenues. As happened last year, there will be a resolution that we will present for you to preserve future levy capacity, and a little bit later in the presentation we'll talk in detail about that. Very similar action to what was proposed to the council last year and what the council did last year. We continue to be conservative with our revenue estimates, preferring to underestimate revenues than to overestimate revenues and find ourselves in a bind. And I think, as the mayor mentioned, this is a balanced budget. There's no use of reserves for our operations. And with that, in fact, we'll talk in a little more detail about our property tax levy and what it means for us moving forward, and Paul's going to take that part of the presentation.
Good evening. Just to quickly walk you through some more of the details that the mayor mentioned earlier. The preliminary data we have from the assessor's office, and this is subject to confirmation later in the year, indicates that the city's total assessed value fell by just under 1%, 0.86%. And as the mayor mentioned, that's inclusive of new construction of 1.1%. What that means is that the base assessed value dropped about 1.9%. And that's compared to the 13% drop that you had last year, but it actually was worse the year before. You had a 15% drop in 2009. So over the last 4 years, you've had more than a third decrease in your assessed value combined. The good news is the decrease is much less this year. In fact, the very good news is it's much less than we had anticipated when we came to you October 3rd. We were forecasting an 8% drop in the assessed value, essentially the base assessed value, depreciation, if you will, and 1% new construction. We hit the 1% new construction right on. The 8% actually turned into a 1.9%, so that's really good news. In terms of how that translates into revenue, you're still rate capped, meaning that your property tax levy rate is at its statutory maximum of $3.10. What that translates to into revenue is $3,686,000 rough numbers. The levy rate that's inclusive of the lid lift. Without the lid lift, your levy rate would be 2.95. So you've got this margin that represents the lid lift revenue for our estimate of the lid lift revenue for 2012. And that represents $175,000. And those are the revenues that are restricted this year coming in that can only be used for EMS purposes under the lid lift code. And this is the last year that revenue will be received. If you compare it to last year was $275,000. So effectively, that drop in assessed value shrinks the amount of that lid lift revenue that's dedicated for EMS. And it's been shrinking over the last several years. Our 8% drop in assessed value would have eliminated it altogether. So with a 2% drop instead of an 8% drop, we still get $175,000 this year for EMS purposes through the lid lift. Okay? So when that lid lift expires in 2012, your levy will revert to your base levy, essentially what it was in 2006 before the lid lift, plus any increases that you've approved up to 1% a year, plus the new construction in those interim periods. So 2013, it goes back to as if you'd never had the lid lift passed in the first place. And so, plus the new construction, okay? So it gets tracked separately. On to slide 21. So similar to last year, to preserve your maximum levy capacity in 2013, if you pass a 1% increase in your pre-lid lift levy, that $2.90, it applies to that $2.95 levy that I talked about before, and it'll preserve that 1% increase, make that available to you in 2013 if you choose to access it. And again, that's worth about $35,000 in 2013, but it also has a permanency to it. To the extent that it's accessed, it can create revenue into the future. If you don't pass your 1%, you're prohibited from accessing that revenue. Any questions on the property tax and the changes associated with the lid lift?
Okay, moving over to the expense side of the ledger, in terms of our key assumptions in the general and street funds, we continued expenditure constraint in our budget process. And through that restraint, and because of the revenue picture, there is an ability to fund some key investments, which we'll elaborate on in a bit, within a balanced operating budget, again, without the use of reserves. Couple key assumptions as we continue to move forward is we are currently negotiating with our firefighting team, the IAFF local, and our 307 local, and so that's an ongoing process with both of those groups. As you know, we are in the midst of a contract with our Police Officers Association, so we're implementing that. And as we mentioned at the previous work session, the budget reflects that non-represented employees basically follow in the same track as what is happening with the Police Officers Association. On the revenue side, for our utility funds, as you know, the council approved a 5-year plan in 2010, and so we will continue with that plan as previously approved. And just as a reminder, this is what will happen in 2012 according to that plan. On the expense side, in the utility funds, again, continued constrained budget process as we worked with the departments on that. And pursuant to our 5-year plan that you adopted and the bond package, we are moving forward with the system improvements that are necessary and are funded. One example of that is the phase 2 at the plant, some design work and other retrofits throughout our system. And then on to the key investments, I think, which is perhaps the focus of our presentation this evening. On the operational side in the general and street funds, as the mayor mentioned, the budget requests restoring funding for 1 police position. It also would implement the creation of a police captain classification for an internal promotional opportunity. And in a bit, Chief Mitchell will share some data regarding police activities, and he will talk about both of these items in some more detail. On the capital side in the general and street funds, there is a proposal to restore our facilities contingency fund. The fund still exists, but it exists with a 0 balance. We will have more detail on this as well as we move through the presentation. At a high level, though, for now, it's noted that the proposal that we have is a $500,000 seeding or reseeding, if you would, of the facilities contingency fund, and then on the creation of a brand new fund that we're calling the Transportation Projects Fund, $750,000, and we will again have more detail for you on that in just a few slides. Also continue to fund support services in the community. 2 items are included in this budget. That's our community ed partnership with the school district, who really provides the recreation arm of our Parks and Recreation program. We don't have a recreation program on our own. They provide that, and this is our partial funding of that program. And then the services across the street through the Children's Home Society. Both of these amounts are the same as the current year. So that's kind of the overview of the budget, the assumptions and the approach that we took on the revenue and the expenditure side, and a very quick overview of the key investments. And with that, we'll begin to drill down a little deeper now on all of that, and I'll turn it over to Jen.
Okay, so overall, the 2012 budget is $29.7 million, and then I broke it out into the different buckets on this slide. Roughly $11.2 million for the general and street funds, $7.4 for the utility operating funds, $10.1 for the capital and debt funds, and then $1 million for other miscellaneous funds. So focusing on the general and street funds, for the revenue projections, you can see overall, we're projecting about a 1% increase from the 2011 budget for 2012. One of the areas you may notice is the other revenue sources transfers in. The 803 for 2011 represents the transfer to the EMS fund, or transferred in from the EMS Fund 125, whereas in 2012, we've broken it out to be included up on the EMS actual transfer line item. And that's money that's actually going to come in and assist the general fund, since the lid lift money has gone down and we've exceeded the amount of revenue, or excuse me, expenses in the fire fund. We can actually access some funds back into the general fund to support our fire EMS purposes. And again, we have to compare those expenses back to the 2006 baseline expenditures for the lid lift before we can access those funds for operational EMS support. On the expense side, we have decreased expenditures in 12 compared to the 2011 budget. Some of the highlights there are with the governmental, general governmental, that's where we had the transfers from the reserves. So that's why that one has decreased, is because that 1.6 in 2011 includes the transfers from reserves. But as you can see, in the council budget is decreased 16,000, and that's due to election costs. The off election years, the expenditures in your fund is lower. The increase in the mayor is the new position, same with police and fire. Again, we have to pay for all the firefighting expenses out of the firefighting fund, and then once we hit the 2006 expenditure level, we can access those EMS funds to assist in the paying of the new firefighter position. Does that make sense? Kind of. All right. I got some yeses and some
I
noes.
understand it. Whether it makes sense or not is
Okay.
another question.
That is a good point. Well, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask. So with the forecast for 2011, as we discussed, the mayor's message is to include restoring the building facilities contingency fund for major maintenance and replacement of buildings, and then the $750,000 that we'll talk about in a moment. The cleanest way to do that, to where 2012 won't have all the transfer issues as we do in 2011, to give a clearer picture of the 2012 budget, is to do a 2011 budget amendment to create the funds, but not authorize any expenditures out of them. So it would just be the shifting of the funds from the unrestricted reserves to those two new funds, so that they're ready to go starting January 1st, 2012. That way we don't have all the transfers between funds that kind of alter the data a little bit and make it difficult to see the true operating expenses for the city. So this just gives an estimate projection for where we would be after the creation of those funds with the reserves.
I have a question.
mhm.
Will we expect this budget amendment before the end of the year then?
Correct. It's all going to be presented together on the 21st of November, and then with possible continuance dates. We'll have some of that for you at the end of the presentation on future steps. So you can see we're projected to end 2011 with an operating surplus. And then once we back out the transfers of reserves, that's where the negative comes into play. But then we still have a $3.1 million total reserve balance, which exceeds the 16% by 1.4 million after implementing those new funds. And again, this will be spelled out in more detail in a few more slides.
I'm going to take you through the extended forecast, building on what Jennifer just talked you through. On this slide, and this is a corrected slide too, so if you, we've got the corrections in there, I think some of you have gotten those. Essentially, we took the 2011 estimates, the 2012 budget, and extended those through to 2013 and 2014. The revenue side is based on a revenue forecast that extends the assumptions that we developed for 2012 into 2013 and 2014. You can see on the slide showing revenue in 2013 of roughly 10.9 million, dropping in 2014 to just under 10.8 million. And that decrease is a function of those lid lift revenues expiring essentially in 2013. So the lid lift expires this year. There's still money in the reserve account in the EMS restricted fund that you can tap in 2013, in 2013, but they won't be available in 2014, essentially. And that's the bulk of the reason why those the revenue decrease is anticipated in 2014. And when you compare that with the operating expense assumptions, and in this scenario we have essentially two scenarios we're showing you. One is that the expenses in 2012, the budgeted expenses of 10.4 million increase at 4.5% per year. And then the far to right columns show expenses increasing at just 2.5% per year. It's difficult to project with any precision about what the expenses will be. Depends on what happens with the labor negotiations, with healthcare costs, et cetera. So we provided those two scenarios to give you a sense. And in the first scenario, 2013, with a 4.5% increase, you can see there's a very small surplus. And in 2014, that turns negative. In the 2.5% growth, you can see it's a somewhat larger surplus, but still turning to a deficit in 2014. So this gives you a sense of what the forecast looks like over the next couple of years. And just to hit on a couple things that Jennifer showed you a slide earlier, that $360,000 of EMS revenue in 2012 is really, again, one of the main reasons for the increase that we show there. The other is an adjustment to the cost allocation plan that's reflected in this budget as well. That is generating an additional $165,000 of revenue as well. So those are the two significant changes in 2012 that result in the increase in revenue that we're showing. Any questions on the forecast?
Moving on to the utility funds. Again, we've factored in the rate increases as authorized per the 5-year plan. And then on the capital side, or for the revenue side of the operating funds, the expenses were held to the same restrictions that the general fund expenses were held to be restrained and continued to do the best job for the city at the lowest cost possible. The capital projects have been mapped out according to the bond revenues that we received, and so those projects have been included for 2012. And then same with stormwater with the implemented rate increases, and then they're included in the capital as well. Some of the other funds of the city, the ER&R fund, Paul has provided us with a replacement plan to move forward with our ER&R replacement for the general and street fund. We have an annual transfer of $150,000 built into our operational budget, again, without the use of reserves to operationally fund the ER&R fund. And then we're going to request expenditures of $300,000 in 2012 to maintain the schedule moving forward. Annually, it will remain at $150,000 into the fund from the operational budget to keep the replacement schedule moving forward.
Plus the sales of any surplus vehicles.
Correct. The proceeds of the sales will go back into the fund as well. The REIT 1 and REIT 2, we use those for the bond payments on the downtown bonds, roughly $190,000 a year. And then our pavement management program is also part of the REIT 2, I believe. Typically, it's a little bit less, but we missed the county's schedule this year, and so we're rolling some of the funds over from 2011 for the streets that didn't get addressed to ensure they get addressed next year and get on the county schedule. the park impact fees, we have three main projects slated for 2012. Hathaway Boat Launch may look familiar. It was on the budget this year. We did receive a grant for that as well from RCO. So that will be tackled in 2012. It had to be put on hold for a little bit, but we will get to that project next year. The Eldridge Boardwalk construction project is connecting some trails and will cost roughly $50,000. And then the Sandy swimming hole improvements to address the parking issues and whatnot up there by the very popular swimming hole, roughly $250,000. One thing to point out with impact fees is the legislation actually extended it to a 10-year period to use them. So instead of that being a 2013 date for a significant portion of the funds, that is extended to 2017.
Jennifer, is that all impact fees?
Correct. Now I'll kick it back to Dave.
Okay, moving on to the topic that was introduced as a key investment, the restoration of the Capital Facilities Fund, the Building Contingency Fund, and the creation of the new Transportation Capital Facilities Fund. To get into some more details on that, we're providing some context and an update on our unrestricted reserves, because this is really a policy question about how we are categorizing and identifying use for our unrestricted reserves. As you know, by your own policy, Council, you require a cash flow, if you would, operating reserve of 16% of our general and street fund operating budget. And using our proposed 2012 budget, the required amount per year policy is roughly $1.7 million. That's roughly 2 months' worth of operating expenses, and it's to cover the fact that we get one of our largest sources of revenue, property taxes, only twice per year, and it helps maintain cash flow and keep everything solvent as we move through the year. Beyond that, we have funds in the fund balance, in the general and street funds that are unrestricted, and before the mayor's proposed investments in the two funds, using our 2011 estimate, there is $2.7 million in that category, if you would, of unrestricted reserves. That equates roughly to an additional 25% of the operating budget. So your required reserve level is 16%, and then we enjoy on top of that an additional 25%. The Facilities Capital Fund, as I mentioned previously, is a fund that existed in the past, and as recent as 2009, at the end of 2009, it had almost $700,000 in fund balance. The entirety of that fund balance was transferred to the general fund as part of the 2010 budget. And so those $700,000 continue to reside in the unrestricted reserves of our general fund, if you would. And so that $2.7 million that I pointed to a moment ago, you might think of $700,000 of that as having originated from the Building Contingency Fund in 2010. And those funds historically and in the current proposal are targeted for future building facilities needs and to cover major maintenance items that come up from time to time. So planning for the future, but also making sure that we're taking care of our facilities to extend their life as long as we can. As Jennifer mentioned, what we're proposing is to reestablish funding into that Capital Facilities Fund in 2011 as a budget amendment on the same evening that the 2012 budget will be before you, and that we move $500,000 back into that fund. As I mentioned, there was almost $700,000 into that fund. We're not proposing to move the entirety of that $700,000 back, but to move $500,000 back. And then as part of the 2012 budget, there are $200,000 of expenses that are identified for a variety of needed facility maintenance and repair items. for City Hall and other facilities. Also, with the last bullet there, taking a little different approach to what we did with ER&R last year. As you'll recall, with the Equipment Repair and Replacement Fund last year, we seeded that out of unrestricted reserves, $600,000, and then we began to appropriate replacement of rolling stock, but we did not include in the operating budget any transfer from general fund over to that Equipment Repair and Replacement Fund, and committed to commence that in year 2 of the fund. And so that's why in the 2012 budget, we described $150,000 as now being just part of how we do business, and we absorbed that into our operating expenditures. We want to be a little more assertive in that same context and begin to kickstart operationally budgeting for that. And so included within the operating budget is $30,000 to provide some more revenue into that fund. And then we would identify, we will work on a plan and try to identify what the appropriate amount would be from year to year to move operationally over into that fund. Moving to the Transportation Capital Fund, this is a new fund. This fund does not exist currently. And similarly to the previous fund we were discussing, the proposal is through a budget amendment here toward the end of the year to create and initially fund this Transportation Capital Fund with $750,000 out of our general fund unrestricted reserves. The proposed purpose of this fund is to provide matching dollars to implement your transportation capital facilities plan, which is actually currently in the update process, and other transportation capital expenses that we would incur. Specifically in 2012, the initial appropriations out of this fund total $213,000, and there are some specific projects that are targeted. First is matching dollars of roughly $130,000 for a CDBG grant that we will submit. And what this project will do is complete the connectivity of sidewalks along Addy. I believe it's from Hamlick Park to 32nd. Along that corridor, there's interruptions and discontinuity in our sidewalks and curb ramps there. It's a project that would be eligible for CDBG money, and that dollar amount that you see would give us the maximum scoring for match, and thus we are proposing that expenditure. The second item there, Evergreen Way, 32nd Street, the intersection. You may recall a little earlier in the year we described a grant application that we were making for STIP funds to upgrade that intersection. That is a key project on your Transportation Capital Facilities Plan, one of 3 elements to ultimately getting an interchange at Highway 14 and 27th, get over to 32nd, and then up 32nd Stiles all the way up the hill and over to the industrial area that we've identified in our UGA. Very significant arterial project that you've identified for economic development. And we're pleased to report that we were successful with that grant application, and we will be the recipient of funds, and we're able to move forward with that project. There's some design work, as you can imagine, that's initially necessary for that, and so in 2012 we would use this fund to provide for those design, that design work and potentially some minor right-of-way acquisition. Along with that project, there is the need to work on the pedestrian crossing at the railroad, and we continue to have a great relationship with the railroad, and they're going to work with us kind of 50-50 to do that pedestrian crossing, I understand, which is very positive, and we're very thankful for that partnership with the railroad. So some funds are included in there to make sure that we can enhance the safety there when we take on that project. And then the remaining funds that would be in there, because remember we were proposing the $750,000 initial appropriation into that fund, that Evergreen Way 32nd Street intersection project over the next several years will require us to leverage their dollars and bring our match. And so what this does, really the bulk of that $750 is to set aside our match for that project and to deliver that project for the community and be able to check that one off check that one off of your plan. And then similarly to the Facilities Capital Fund, we want to jumpstart our operational funding into that Transportation Capital Fund, and so we propose in 2012, right out of the operating budget, $30,000 in appropriations, just to begin that. So what would be the impact to our unrestricted reserves by implementing this proposal? And just to refresh, your 16% of operating budget requirement is a little under 1.7 million. Again, that's using our proposed 2012 budget. After we're done, the remaining unrestricted general fund reserves after these investments would be a little under $1.5 million, which is an additional 14% of the budget. And the administration's opinion that that would continue to be compared to some other communities, a very healthy unrestricted reserve on top of the council policy reserve. One thing to keep in mind is that the total of the 500 for the building capital fund and the 750 for the transportation fund is 1.25 million. Those continue to be general funds. They can be expended for anything. While they would reside in those funds, they would be restricted to the purposes of the fund that you have identified. However, unlike a utility fund, for example, they would be available to the council if the direction were to change, or to the administration if the direction were to change. However, as you know, in looking at our Transportation Capital Facilities Plan, and all communities across the county, and I'm sure across the state and the country, as they look at their transportation capital facilities needs, they really are unfunded plans. And the way that those projects get funded is through the grant process right now. There may be some changes in that as the federal and state governments work through how they handle delivering transportation infrastructure in the nation. But for now, that's how we are able to provide transportation infrastructure for the community. So we think it's prudent to identify some of the unrestricted reserves for a high priority for the community, and we know for the council in terms of your capital facilities plan, so that we can make good on the intersection at Evergreen and 32nd, and then continue to move forward in the future. But just want to remind you that they would continue to be general funds, if you would, and they are available.
Yes, I have a question. Okay, so you answered one of my questions about the restricted or unrestricted proposal for these two funds, the facilities fund and the transportation fund. The money in these funds, would they qualify for the matches that you're talking about for the different grants you're considering applying for?
Yes, they qualify for one of the categories of match. On the transportation side, not always, but often there are two categories of match. Public match, which is what these funds would qualify for. And so your use of these funds in that regard would absolutely be right in line with how we partner with the granting agencies, our federal and state government, to deliver these projects. The private match is the TIF revenues that we receive, which are paid by the private sector. You don't, well, depending upon the grant, there is a minimum amount of private match that you have to have, but you get minimum scoring, and then there's a max scoring amount, and you always would want to try to maximize that if it's available to you. There may be some specific types of grants where, although you can get points for private match, they aren't absolutely required, but again, without them, it makes it less likely that you'll be able to qualify. And just by way of example, this intersection project at Evergreen and 32nd, in receiving the grant, I believe that we were able to maximize in both scoring categories for public with this amount of funding, and on the TIF side, but we have not realized all of the TIF revenue that we asserted for our application because the project spans a number of years and goes out until 2014, I believe. And so we identify projected revenues around TIF and are identifying a significant portion of those toward this project. That's an example of how we would do that. So with that, I will turn it back to Jen, where we can look at the departments a little bit, and then the chief will have some information.
This year, instead of going department by department and saying maintaining status quo, we kept it simple and just said that the majority of the departments are maintaining status quo. So we chose just to highlight the departments that we're going to have some topics to discuss, and that's pretty much the police department again. The other departments are going to continue the current programs that they're offering and are in the current budget. So I'm going to turn it over to Chief Mitchell to discuss the police department.
Thank you, Jen. We have a couple slides that we'll take a look at tonight. The data that we use to compile these figures comes directly from CRESA. And what we're trying to show here is just provide some information to council on some of the growth that we're experiencing in our call volume versus the number of officers that we're staffed with. And you can see on this graph here, in 2009, we had a total of 20 officers. And in any of this data here, all these officers includes the chief's position. So in 2009, our calls to service at that time were a little over 8,200 calls, which resulted in about 412 calls per year per officer. 2010, we decreased, we're down to 19 officers, but our call volume continues to increase up to that year 10,429 calls, or 549 calls per officer. This year, 2011, with 18 officers, we're projecting to come in at a little over 16,500 calls. At the time this data was compiled, year to date at that time for 2011, we are already at 12,348 calls. And if we come in at the 16.5 like we believe, that's 919 calls handled per officer per year. With the addition of a 19th officer for this data, we get a little bit of relief in that the officer would have a little bit more manageable level of 871 calls per year. On the next slide, we're looking at, sometimes you'll hear data of the number of officers per thousand. And as part of our strategic planning process and as we move forward in doing our business plan, we're trying to determine just exactly what that number should be. But just for some historical data, you can see in 2005, our staffing levels were 1.5 number of officers per thousand. Down to 1.48 in 2008. So during that 4-year period, we went up and down, but we averaged about 1.49 officers per thousand. In 2009, we dropped down to 1.37, 2010, 1.35, and now at 11, we're down to 1.27. With the 18 officers for 2012, if it was remain the same, we'd drop even further to 1.25 per thousand. On the last there at 2012 with 19 officers, we kind of stopped that decreasing, that erosion, and bring that back up to 1.32 officers per thousand. On the far right, you'll see two figures. One of them is a 2010, the Western U.S. average comes in at 1.7. Per thousand, and then for cities our size is 1.6. So we're a little bit below that, but hopefully by adding this other officer, we can at least stop the continuing downtrend in number of officers per thousand and the number of calls that the officers have to take.
Chief?
Ron?
Two questions. One is the Crescent budget going up this year? And if so, by how much? Because it seemed like every year it goes up, but how much?
Last year, we actually were about the same, a little bit less, but it's gonna go up roughly $7,800 this year.
Okay. And you also made, or at least it was identified earlier in one of the slides that you wanted to have an officer up and running by January 1. Is that do you have lateral transfer? Do you have a list that's waiting to hire from?
It would be our preference to go through that process, if approved, beginning January 1. So I would not expect to have somebody there.
Okay.
I can tell you that just depend, you never know what you're gonna get when you cast that net out for officers. And I would rather continue on and find the right person, the right fit for the city, for the department. So that may take me 4 or 5 months. I may have to go out and hire an entry-level person, which is gonna prolong the process a little bit further. I just don't know until we actually.
As long as you're sitting in the hot seat right now, do you have any other expenditures like vehicles this year?
Not for this year, not for 2012.
Right, okay.
Dave was up first. Where we go? I just wanted to say, I'm very glad to hear that you will be slow and deliberative in the process of choosing an officer. Those are key positions.
Yes.
And I like our police department, and I would like to keep it pretty much that way. So,
Well, we have been fortunate. We do have a good group of officers, and we're very particular. None of us just want a warm body, so.
Let 900 calls per officer, you're not gonna have just a warm body. You better be busy.
Dave?
Chief, 2 questions. Looking at the slide before this one.
Okay.
Looking at that double call volume,
Mhm.
do you have a feel for what's driving that? Are they all the same types of calls?
No. Call volume has pretty much increased in every category with the exception of auto thefts, which has gone down.
Exception of what?
Auto theft.
Okay.
I have to believe that part of it's the economy that we're experiencing. And I just said, this isn't unique just to Washougal. They're experiencing this countywide. The thing that does alarm me is some of the calls that seem to be on the increase that represent a greater hazard to the officer and to the community and require a quicker response time. Those are the ones that bother me. So,
And the second question is, are there outside resources that are available to help with some of these problems?
with the staffing or?
Are there task forces that are working on some of these problems in Clark County? County task forces, state task forces, federal task forces? For example, I know that periodically, drug task force is working in Portland. God knows, I hope we don't need them here, but if we do, are they available to us? And is that one of the types of problems that?
Luckily, the opportunities that we have for help from outside the county would be drug task force or major crimes or SWAT. And luckily, we haven't had to tap that yet. But those are available to us. We pay a certain amount each year for SWAT. It's like insurance. I hope I never have to use it, but it's there. Same thing, we participate in major crimes. So should we have a major incident that would overwhelm the department, we can bring those resources in to help us out for a few days till we can get this under control.
So I have a question. With regards to the number of calls, has there been a change between 2009 and this year with regards to how we're logging the number of calls? I mean, is it all automatically logged through CRESA?
And part of the problem in collecting this data, I wanted to be able to give you consistent information. And for us, the best way was just pull that directly from Cresa. So we downloaded that information from Cresa.
But you have other reporting agencies that you report to, though, don't you?
Yes. So we, some of our data, we get call volume from Cresa.
Right.
And then we also export data via EPR, our reporting system, to the county, which goes then to the WASDC website, which reports our UCR uniform crime reports that you can pull up online. So those numbers are not going to match up, just because one's a call, we may get a call that may not turn into anything, or versus one that requires a report, much more contact. So that's why there's a little bit of discrepancy in the UCR data compared to our calls. But when you look at a dispatch call, we have to do something with it.
Right.
They're the front line.
Yep. Exactly.
The initial.
And, no two calls are always the same. We may get a call that takes us 5 minutes to handle. One, we can be on for a couple hours and tie up every person in the department on that call.
So along those lines, if you were to compare the 2009 to current numbers for calls that generated a report, do you see a doubling trend? Or do you remember the relationship between our 2009 calls versus 2010 and 11 calls that generated a report versus just the call-outs?
I can pull that data.
Okay.
I can pull that data. I have that data available to us. And we've switched and kind of changed how we've recorded data, not by design. It's because we had an older system that we used called CrimeStar. And then when we switched to EPR a couple of years ago, it changed all of our numbers. So our numbers just weren't consistent. So again, that's kind of why I went with the dispatch calls, because that was a consistent data that I could provide to you.
Okay. And how far back do our Cresa numbers go?
I believe insofar as getting or obtaining this type of information, I think 2008.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it goes back forever to the creation of Cresa, but back in the early days, it was number of keyed microphones. I mean, it literally got down to a expense number for that at the end of the year. And that's, you bring up a good point, Michael, and hopefully all the council will, keep under consideration as you look at the request for the additional officer. While you've got some numbers there that are, anywhere from 550 last year to 871 to 919 calls per officer, those are coming off of, as Chief said, the Cresa numbers. That doesn't talk about car stops that they do on their own. That doesn't talk about self-initiated. That doesn't talk about all the other things that they find out there on their own. That's literally getting back just to the calls for service that come in through that system. So even though these numbers are high and continuing to move higher, what they're actually doing is a significantly higher number than that. As Chief mentioned, though, we wanted to be able to give you something that we could go back to and validate and say, these are comparable numbers at a point in time on either one of the systems. Certainly 2011 estimates that through the end of the year, given the ratio that we're at now, but to be able to put all those other numbers in there, I imagine you'd have somebody there for an awfully long time trying to disseminate until we weren't double counting certain calls, so.
Chief, also, you talked about the Cresa budget going up $7,800 this year. At one point, didn't they use the calls out to they estimated their costs based on the number of calls each agency had? In other words, Clark County Sheriff or Vancouver would have a larger number by far than yours, but how do they get their numbers to equate what Washougal pays?
They still use a formula like that based on what the expected use will be, with a minor adjustment for their overhead. So, and I'm sure they look at these numbers too and realize, okay, you guys are on an upward trend, so Yeah, they use a formula. SWAT's figured the same way. It's figured on a formula of population and whatnot, how they come up with their number.
You've got more for us.
Yeah, okay. On the person with the funding for the officer position, as the mayor had mentioned in his opening remarks, in 2009, we were at 20 sworn officers for the police department. Over the last couple of years, we had 2 vacancies, one of them from a resignation, and the other one was from an unexpected medical retirement. And neither of those positions were replaced. Right now, we're at 18 sworn officers. That includes myself. During that time period, our 911 dispatch calls have pretty much doubled from 2009 to, again, what we're looking at this year for a little over 16,500 calls for service in 2011. So we have experienced a dramatic rise in our increase of our dispatch calls when our staffing numbers have actually started to go down. And not only has the call volume increased, but we're seeing an increase, again, this is countywide, with certain types of calls that do represent a greater risk to both the community and to our officers. So with that in mind, I am asking for council to restore our one position, patrol position, beginning January 1 of 2012. The second note is on the creation of the captain's position. And I think most of you were here. Back in 2009, the adoption of the council position was introduced at council workshop. It was discussed. But at that time, that proposal did meet, at least I thought, with favorable response from council. Unfortunately, we held off on that position. We had some changes internally with staffing that really, at that time, that really probably wasn't the best thing to do until we kind of restructured the police department and figured out where we're going to go. The captain's position is a part of an ongoing restructuring or rebuilding of the police department. Presently, we have 1 administrative sergeant and 2 patrol sergeants. In the proposed restructure with the captain's position, we would eliminate the administrative sergeant's position. Now, if this was approved, this would require council to amend the department head manual to include a pay range for the captain's position. Yes.
Sorry, Chief Mitchell.
No,
Can we go back to the slide that has the red, yeah, the one before that, there you go. Can you remind me how many reserve police officers we have again?
Sure. Last year at this time, we had 1 reserve. Right now, we have 3.
3.
And we're looking to add another couple of reserve officers.
Okay. Do those reserve officers ride alone, ever? They drive?
They can. They cannot work alone, but they go through an academy process that's 6 months long. Then they go through a 12-week, up to 12-week FTO program, just like the officer would go. Upon the completion of that, then they can ride alone.
Okay. And my next question is regarding the calls. Would any of these calls be attributed to, say, a reserve officer? Or, I mean, are they allowed to go to any of these calls alone without a paid officer with them?
This would have, there could be a small representation there of a reserve officer handling that call. Probably about as many of those fall off that you don't see. An example that would be, if I'm in the office and someone comes up to the window and they need help with something and the officers are out, I'll take that call, I'll handle it. But I don't call dispatch and let dispatch know I'm out with a citizen. So we lose some, we gain some. So to answer your question, though, yeah, there could be a few calls in there that was handled by a reserve.
Okay, thanks.
Chief, Why do you want to go from an administrative sergeant to a captain? What's the reason? If you have that guy in there doing that now and eliminate that one and go to a captain, what's the reason for that?
Sure. Right now, I am the only one that is not in the association. So as this position would remove the administrative sergeant, pull them out of the union. So that helps in planning, in anything that might come up with potential discipline problems down the road. We're relatively flat. So when it comes down to doing, let's say, if there was a need for an internal affairs investigation, I would have to do that. Because we can't have someone in the guild reviewing another guild member. So it also allows for a consistent person to be in charge in my absence. And a lot of it, too, is we're asking them to work outside the boundaries of what the sergeant's position is. So it allows much more help on my side and keeps that person kind of working within their job description and not working outside that.
Is there going to be a difference in the budget for pay?
For a mere investment of probably about $12,000.
A mere.
Yep. David?
Why a captain as opposed to a lieutenant?
I think there's sixes. I think that's probably about the same position. You look at Camus, it's captain, battleground, lieutenant. We started out with a captain's position because that seemed to be the next progression of someone that was outside the association or the guild. Whether or not lieutenant would be in the guild, some do, some don't, but a captain has always been outside that.
Is the lieutenant outside the guild?
It probably would be if we created it. I see them as equal positions, lieutenant and captain,
Okay.
from pay to responsibilities.
Saving a little bit of money, though, we already have a captain's badge.
This is true.
Unused.
11,995, right?
Now I understand.
Other questions for Chief Mitchell? Okay. Dave or Jen, the next steps forward?
Before Jen goes to the next step slides, there was one thing that I wanted to mention before, just briefly. It doesn't have relevance specifically for the 2012 budget that's before you, but it has to do with the levy lid lift. That lift expires at the end of next year and will no longer be a source of revenue per se in terms of new revenues moving forward. However, because of the supplanting issues that Paul has eloquently described to us in the past, there's fund balance in that Fund 125. And effectively, because of some of the AV nuances, assessed valuation nuances, like the not as serious decline that we've experienced this year, it's almost as if that lift continues to work for us into those out years through the supplanting monies collected during the course of the levy. As you can imagine, just intuitively, because the city has chosen previously to fund its EMS through the combination of a general levy and a lift, when one of those legs of the stool, if you would, expires, the question that immediately arises is, well, should we seek to renew that lift? And we have been saying previously we probably can't even do that in 2013 because there won't be any room in the rate that we would be capped, and it would be futile to do that. These latest assessed valuation numbers open a window there and give us some potential opportunity, but our initial thinking, just so that to let you in on kind of what our initial thinking is as we move forward on the EMS side, is to continue to use those supplanting dollars and allow the assessed valuation equation to even perhaps improve so that a more meaningful and productive lift could be presented to the community that would be better able to sustain that important service in the community. And then there's the question of the fact that there's a staggering between the general levy and the lift. And would it be appropriate to try to reconcile their expirations so that the EMS question could happen once every so often? Or should they remain separate? Is it the appropriate mechanism to actually use the two different mechanisms to fund that? Or should we look at something else? And as you know, we've got several years left on the EMS levy. So those are the types of questions that we're pondering. Again, it's not specifically germane to the 2012 budget, but just something for you to place hold for future conversation as we think about funding that important service. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jen for the last piece.
Just to clarify on the 12,000 for the captain position, it is included in the budget package that we're presenting. So it wouldn't be over and above what's already included in the 2012 package. The next steps, November 14th, as we mentioned, strategic planning is going to provide an update of where they're at and the information that they've compiled so far. In addition to that, we'll have a budget work session to further the discussion of the budget. November 21st will be the public hearing. November 7th, let me back up. We will be requesting a public hearing in November, and then that public hearing will be held on November 21st, where we'll present the budget and the tax levies that we talked about, or resolutions, excuse me, that we talked about for preserving that 1% for the future. We'll also present the 2011 budget amendment that we've discussed tonight to establish those reserve funds for building and transportation. And we'll also be asking for a potential decision on the budget on the 21st. Should that not occur on the 21st, we can continue that to December 5th or December 19th, depending on council action.
Just one brief comment there, Jen. Council, certainly between, we're about to get to your budget books and pass those out, and Jen's going to walk you through that a little bit. It's a lot of information. We understand that the mayor has presented his budget this evening. We have, I believe it's 3 weeks between now and the 14th, where you can review the information and consider the information. Would encourage you to please contact Jen or myself if you have any specific detailed question that either comes up or we didn't answer in this presentation or you notice in the notebook, and we would appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about any questions that you might have in advance of our work session on the 14th.
Since we have Paul Lewis, the financial guru, in the room, and Jennifer sitting here, I have a question about why would it be an advantage to the city of Washougal to go to a 2-year budget? And aren't we allowed to do that?
Yes, we are allowed to do a 2-year budget. There are advantages and disadvantages. It takes the process to every 2 years for the long drawn-out walkthrough, but then there still are amendments that you do at certain points along the way. So it is a possibility if that's the route that council would like to go.
Paul used to oversee a biennial budget in Vancouver. I don't know if you have strengths or weaknesses of that, or?
No, I think sometimes giving yourself a little bit longer planning horizon is useful. Sometimes it's not, especially when things change a lot, as they have the last couple of years. So I think, to the extent that people have 2-year budgets or have 2-year budgets, they've really been adjusting on a much shorter cycle, probably even more frequently than annually, given the recent changes in both the assessed valuations that we've received. So in a more stable environment, I think a 2-year budget is useful. In a less certain environment, a 1-year budget is probably what you'd be faced with anyways. You'd be making adjustments. So as Jennifer mentioned, I think if you have a fairly extended process, doing that once every 2 years in more depth can be helpful. But I think you've been well served with an annual budget, I think, in these last couple of years. You may be well suited to a biannual budget in a couple of years.
So I have budget binders for folks. This is going to be on the iPad, folks, iPad shortly. I'm in the process of bookmarking it so that you can get through it easier. I apologize, I didn't get all the way through it, but I will have it ASAP. If you would like a hard copy, you're more than welcome. But basically, this is in the same format as last year with the preliminary budget. The mayor's budget message is in there. The ordinances are in there, but those will be modified before the final budget hearing. And then it just goes department by department. One thing that I wanted to point out is on the, ooh, no page numbers. On page, after the budget ordinance, there's a summary of all funds, 2012 annual budget, where it breaks out the 16% policy restricted reserves and the remaining reserves. In order to tie that back to the presentation, you need to add the $946,000 with the $483,000 ending street fund balance. So,
What's the page heading for that?
there's no page number. It is 1,
The title of it is Summary of All Funds.
3, 4,
That's what it
5,
says.
It's
6,
about 5,
7.
6.
Right there, right there.
Roughly
Just
page
that
7, depending on what page you start with. You can't, the page numbers didn't print. I apologize. They should match the table of contents, but they didn't print.
And I'm sorry, run through that again for me?
So it shows the ending fund balance of 2.6 million for the general fund,
Yes,
with the 16% policy restricted reserves at 1.6,
yes,
and then unrestricted at 946.
yes.
That doesn't tie to the presentation until you add in the street fund, because it's the general and street fund in the slide presentation of the 483,000. So once you add those two together, it'll equal the 1.4-ish on the slide presentation. And this is after implementing those transfers to the funds, and you'll notice that those new funds are listed in hopes that those will be approved. And then it goes through, again, just page by page with the detail, line item by department and by fund. So if you, in going through the minutia of detail in here, if you desire, we are available to answer questions should you run across something that doesn't make sense.
And I just wanted to add, Mayor, if I could, I wanted to thank Jennifer and her team and the department heads. There's a lot of work that goes into putting this budget together for you, council, and for the community. And as you know, we've had some turnover in finance, and also Paul has been very helpful, I think, instrumental in coming alongside Jennifer. So I just wanted to make sure that she knew how much the mayor and I appreciated her efforts in getting this budget put together.
Okay, so we've got about 3 weeks before we revisit the budget in more detail. Any questions on what's been presented this evening or the new initiatives or any of that type of stuff before we move on for this evening's business? Okay. That brings us to another opportunity for public input. If there are any members of the public that would like to address council this evening? Okay. I have no other updates this evening. Mr. Scott, do you have any?
No, thank you, Mayor.
Okay. Pardon? Yeah, no meeting next week. Council, any items from council members? David?
We give water discounts to senior citizens, I believe.
For low income senior
Yeah,
citizens.
there's an income threshold.
Correct.
Yeah. Do we do that for veterans?
We don't currently.
Not specifically. We are in the process, as you'll recall, with FCS, they are doing a cost of service analysis, which includes offering additional discounts and how that would affect the rate structure as a whole.
Is that one of them that's being considered?
Correct.
Okay,
Oh, veterans specifically?
yes.
I know disability is one of them, disabled citizens, but I'll have to check on on veterans, I apologize. I'm not sure.
Well, I was thinking of disabled vets, so.
Okay.
So it'd fall
They
under
would
one.
qualify under the disabled
Yeah.
portion.
Vets includes people like me, and I don't think I qualify. But disabled vets, that's another category altogether. Is there a precedent for that within the county?
It is, I believe, disability discounts. I have seen at other communities in the area, yes, because we've been doing some research
Okay.
in the department.
I'll be interested in seeing that. Thank you.
Didn't Vancouver just start a utility assistance program a couple of years ago?
I'm not sure.
That is privately funded from additional, it's kind of like the heating bills and that type
For
of stuff
the
from PUD?
Yes, they did.
So, yeah, I think there are certainly some areas that we can look at from different utility standpoints. Other items from council? Okay, again, for the public, we are not back here until November 7th again, and we are adjourned for this evening.